The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of James Walker's modest apartment in New Portland. The year was 2157, and humanity had spread across the solar system. But some things never changed, like the way his biomechanical leg ached on cold mornings. James sat on the edge of his bed, watching the soft blue diagnostic lights pulse along his artificial limb. The doctors had told him he was lucky. Most soldiers hit by Nexus plasma weapons didn't survive at all. He had only lost his leg and part of his nervous system. The neural implants that helped him walk flickered occasionally, sending tiny sparks of discomfort through his body. His small bedroom was neat and organized, a habit from his 20 years in the space fleet. His captain's uniform hung in a protective case on the wall, the medals and ribbons carefully preserved behind clear glass. He never wore it anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away. Sometimes, on nights when sleep wouldn't come, he would look at it and remember his crew, his ship, and the battle that had changed everything. The morning news played softly from the wall screen as James went through his daily routine. The automatic coffee maker had his drink ready. Black, no sugar, just like in the service. As he reached for the cup, his hand trembled slightly. The neural implants were acting up again. Hot coffee splashed over the rim, leaving dark spots on the counter. "Not today," he muttered, grabbing a cloth to clean up the mess. The doctors had warned him that the older model implants would need regular adjustments, but medical care was expensive, even for veterans. The newer models were better, of course, but those were reserved for the wealthy colonists on Mars and Europa. Through his window, he could see the city coming to life. Flying cars moved in orderly lanes between the tall buildings, their anti-gravity fields humming softly. Holographic advertisements floated in the air, promoting everything from the latest neural upgrades to vacation packages on Venus. A group of children walked to school, their transparent tablets displaying homework assignments in glowing letters. James pulled on his civilian clothes, simple, practical items that would help him blend in with the crowd. The last thing he wanted was attention. He had gotten enough of that during the war, when his face was plastered across every newsfeed in the solar system. Captain James Walker, the hero of Saturn's rings, the man who had held the line against the Nexus invasion fleet. Now he just wanted to be anonymous. Another face in the crowd, but his leg made that difficult. The biomechanical limb was functional but outdated. Unlike the sleek, natural-looking prosthetics available to the wealthy, his was clearly mechanical, with exposed joints and visible power cables. Most people tried not to stare, but he could always feel their eyes on him. As he prepared to leave his apartment, James checked his supplies. He needed to go shopping today. The automated delivery services were convenient, but they were also expensive. Besides, he preferred to pick out his own food. It gave him a reason to get out, to stay connected to the world around him. His personal tablet chimed softly, displaying a reminder about his medication. The neural stabilizers helped keep the implants functioning smoothly, though they weren't as effective as they used to be. He swallowed the small blue pill with the last of his coffee, hoping it would be enough to get him through the day without any glitches. The door slid open with a soft hiss as James stepped into the hallway. His neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was watering her indoor garden. She smiled and waved, one of the few people who treated him normally. Her husband had served in the Mars Defense Force during the war. She understood. "Going to the store, James?" she asked, adjusting the nutrient feed to her hydroponic tomatoes. "Yes, Mom," he replied with a polite nod. "Need to stock up on a few things." "Be careful out there," she said, her eyes briefly glancing at his leg. "The weather report says there might be electromagnetic disturbances today. Could affect your implants." James thanked her for the warning, though he already knew. He could feel it in his circuits, like sailors of old could feel storms in their bones. But he couldn't put off the shopping any longer. Besides, he had faced far worse than a little electromagnetic interference. As he walked toward the building's elevator, his leg made a soft whirring sound with each step. Just another day in the life of a disabled veteran. trying to find his place in a world that had moved on from the war that had cost him so much. Wilson's Marketplace stood out among the gleaming towers of New Portland. While other stores had switched to the fully automated systems, Wilson still believed in personal service. The old-fashioned sliding glass doors opened as James approached, releasing the smell of fresh bread and coffee into the morning air. Inside, holographic signs floated above each aisle, displaying prices and nutritional information. A few robot helpers rolled quietly between the shelves, restocking items and cleaning the floors. But unlike the bigger chains, Wilson's still had human cashiers and staff members who knew their regular customers by name. James grabbed a shopping cart, its smart display recognizing him and pulling up his usual shopping list. The cart's wheels hummed softly as it adjusted to match his walking pace. He started in the produce section, where real fruits and vegetables, not the synthetic kind, were still available, though expensive. The morning crowd was thin. A few elderly shoppers examined tomatoes under the bright lights, while a young mother helped her child reach for an apple. James noticed how the child stared at his mechanical leg with open curiosity, but the mother quickly pulled him away, whispering apologies. As James reached for a bunch of bananas, his neural implants suddenly flickered. The warning Mrs. Thompson had given him about electromagnetic disturbances proved true. His artificial leg locked up mid-step, throwing him off balance. He grabbed the nearest display to steady himself, but it was too late. Apples tumbled from their careful pyramid, rolling across the polished floor. The sound drew attention from everyone nearby. James tried to kneel to pick them up, but his malfunctioning leg wouldn't cooperate. The diagnostic lights along his limb flashed red, indicating a temporary system failure. "What's going on here?" A sharp voice called out. Robert Pierce, the new store manager, strode toward the scene. He wore the latest fashion from the Mars colonies, a sleek suit that changed colors slightly as he moved, marking him as someone who cared about status and appearance. Several customers had stopped to watch. Their retinal cameras, standard implants these days, recorded everything, tiny red lights blinking in their eyes. James could feel his face growing hot with embarrassment as he struggled to remain standing. "I'm sorry," James said, trying to explain. "My prosthetic is malfunctioning. There's electromagnetic interference today. Do you know how much these apples cost?" Pierce cut him off, his voice carrying through the store. "They're imported from the Earth Prime agricultural domes. This isn't some cheap synthetic fruit." Two robot helpers had already started cleaning up the mess, their efficient movements making James feel even more useless. His leg was beginning to respond again, but the calibration was off, making each movement jerky and uncertain. "I can pay for any damage," James offered quietly, reaching for his tablet to transfer credits. Pierce looked James up and down, taking in his simple clothes and outdated prosthetic. "Maybe you should stick to the synthetic food section," he said loudly. "It's more appropriate for your situation." The words hung in the air like poison. A few older customers who knew James looked away uncomfortably. One of the human staff members, Tom from the dairy section, started to step forward, but Pierce's sharp glance stopped him. In fact, Pierce continued, straightening his color-shifting tie. "Perhaps you should try the automated stores. They're better equipped to handle special needs cases." James felt the old familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Before the war, he would have put this man in his place with a few well-chosen words. But now he was just tired. Tired of explaining, tired of defending, tired of being seen as less than whole. He was about to turn and leave when a small voice spoke up from behind him. "That's not very nice," the voice said clearly. "You shouldn't talk to heroes that way." James turned, his leg wearing in protest, to see a young boy in a junior science academy uniform standing there. The boy's eyes were bright with recognition and something else, anger, but not at James. The child was glaring straight at Manager Pierce, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. The morning light streaming through the store's windows caught the boy's academy badge, making it gleam like a star. And in that moment, everything changed. Manager Pierce's face reddened at the boy's words. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a child. The store had grown quiet, except for the soft hum of the cleaning robots still gathering fallen apples. "Young man," Pierce said, his color-shifting tie now pulsing an angry red, "this is none of your business. Where are your parents?" The boy, Tommy Anderson according to his academy nameplate, stepped closer to James. "I don't need my parents to know when someone's being mean. We learned about the Nexus War in school last week. That's a Mark 7 combat prosthetic," he said, pointing at James's leg. "They only gave those to frontline officers." James looked down at the boy in surprise. Most kids these days thought of the war as ancient history, something that happened before they were born. But this one was different. Pierce laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Listen, kid, this is a business. We can't have people knocking over displays and disrupting." The electromagnetic interference warning went out to everyone's neural feeds this morning. Tommy interrupted, tapping his junior academy tablet. "Look, it's right here. Level 3 disturbance expected. Citizens with medical implants advised to take precautions." His small voice grew stronger. "You should have put out warning signs." More customers had gathered now. Their retinal cameras were still recording, red lights blinking faster. Some had started sharing the footage through their neural networks. Above them, the store's holographic signs flickered with the same interference that had affected James's leg. "I don't need a child telling me how to run my store," Pierce snapped. He turned back to James. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We can't be responsible for any more incidents." Tommy's face scrunched up in concentration. He pressed something on his tablet, and suddenly the store's main display screen came to life. A video began playing, footage from the Battle of Saturn's Rings. "This is from our history lesson," Tommy said loudly. "Computer, maximize volume." The screen showed a massive space battle. Earth ships, desperately outnumbered, fought against the alien Nexus fleet. In the center of the formation, one ship stood out, the TSS Hope. The video zoomed in on the bridge, where a younger James Walker stood giving orders, his uniform crisp and his face determined. "That's you, isn't it?" Tommy asked James, though he clearly already knew the answer. "You're Captain Walker. Your ship held the line while the civilian transports escaped. My parents were on one of those ships." James swallowed hard. He hadn't watched this footage in years, hadn't wanted to remember that day when victory came at such a terrible cost. His hand unconsciously moved to his leg, remembering the moment when the Nexus beam had torn through the bridge. Pierce's face had gone from red to pale. "Captain Walker," he stammered. The name was clearly familiar to him now. Everyone knew about the Battle of Saturn's Rings. It was the turning point of the war. "The same," James said quietly. It was the first time he'd acknowledged his past identity in public for years. Other customers had started sharing their own archived footage now. The store's holographic displays filled with images from the war. James recognized himself in many of them, receiving his medals, visiting wounded soldiers, leading the final charge against the Nexus mothership. "My mom says you saved over 10,000 people that day," Tommy continued, his young voice carrying in the hushed store. "She says if it wasn't for you and your crew, half of Earth's colonies would have been lost." James felt a strange mix of emotions: embarrassment at being recognized, pride in his service, and gratitude for this unexpected defender. His leg had finally stabilized, the neural implants adjusting to the interference. He stood straighter, some of his old command presence returning. Pierce opened his mouth to speak again, but now other voices were rising from the crowd. Not all of them had been on those rescue ships, but everyone knew someone who had. The war might have ended years ago, but its impact still rippled through their lives. And in that moment, standing between a stammering manager and a brave young boy, James Walker felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He felt like a captain again. Tommy's tablet projected a shimmering hologram in the air between James and Manager Pierce. It showed a detailed diagram of the Mark VII combat prosthetic, rotating slowly as the boy began to explain. "See these scaring patterns?" Tommy pointed to the distinctive marks on James's leg. "They're from Nexus plasma weapons. We study them in advanced physics. The alien weapons left unique radiation traces that can't be faked." His small finger traced the air, matching the marks on the real prosthetic to the hologram. The crowd of customers had grown larger. Parents held their children up to see better. Store employees had stopped pretending to work, watching openly now. Even the cleaning robots had paused their duties, their sensors focused on the scene. In our history class, Tommy continued, his voice growing more confident, "We learned that only 17 officers survived direct hits from Nexus weapons. The radiation should have killed them all, but their ship's shield technology saved them." He looked up at James with bright eyes. "That's why your neural implants still glitch sometimes, isn't it? The radiation damage never fully healed." James nodded slowly, surprised by the boy's knowledge. "That's right," he said. "The doctors did their best, but some scars don't go away." Tommy turned to face the gathered crowd. His academy uniform gleamed under the store lights, its smart fabric adjusting to his movements. "My parents were scientists on Europa when the Nexus attacked. They were working on water purification systems for the colonies." His voice trembled slightly, but he kept speaking. "The alien ships came out of nowhere. They targeted the civilian stations first. Nobody knew why they attacked. They never tried to communicate. They just started destroying everything." Tommy's tablet displayed footage of the massive Nexus ships, their dark hulls absorbing light like black holes. But Captain Walker's ship, the TSS Hope, wasn't supposed to be there that day, Tommy said, excitement creeping into his voice. "They were on their way back to Earth for repairs. The Hope's engines were damaged, half the weapons weren't working, and they'd already lost too many crew members." The store's main screens were now showing the battle footage in sync with Tommy's words. Everyone could see the TSS Hope, a relatively small ship, positioning itself between the civilian transports and the Nexus fleet. When Captain Walker saw the attack starting, he could have called for reinforcements and waited. That would have been the safe choice. Tommy looked at James with admiration. But he didn't wait. He knew there wasn't time. The Hope charged straight into the Nexus fleet. James felt his throat tighten as he watched the old footage. He remembered giving those orders, remembered his crew's faces as they realized what he was asking them to do. Not one of them had hesitated. "The Hope's shields were failing," Tommy narrated, his voice rising with emotion. "But they kept fighting. They held the line while my parents and thousands of others escaped. When a Nexus beam hit the bridge..." He paused, looking at James's leg. Captain Walker was still standing, still giving orders, even after he was hurt. Manager Pierce had backed away slightly, his expensive suit now a muted gray as its smart fabric responded to his discomfort. Other customers were whispering among themselves, sharing more archived footage through their neural networks. "My mom says," Tommy said, his voice clear in the hushed store, "that when they got the evacuation alert, she was scared. But then she heard Captain Walker's voice on all channels. He said, 'This is Earth space. You are not welcome here. We stand together.'" The boy's chest swelled with pride. And they did stand. The Hope's crew stood until help arrived. They saved everyone they could. James remembered those words. They had come automatically, born from years of training and a deep belief in humanity's right to exist, to thrive among the stars. He hadn't known his ship-wide broadcast was being picked up by the civilian stations. "So you see," Tommy said, turning back to Manager Pierce, "you're not just being mean to a customer. You're being mean to a hero. My hero." His small hand reached out and took James's larger one. "And I won't let you do that." The silence in the store was absolute. Even the usual hum of electronics seemed muted, as if the very machines were waiting to see what would happen next. The store's automated lights dimmed slightly as Tommy's tablet projected a larger hologram. A three-dimensional map of the solar system filled the air, showing the positions of Earth's colonies during the Nexus War. Red dots marked civilian stations, while blue markers showed military positions. "Here's where it happened," Tommy said, pointing to the space near Saturn's rings. His finger moved through the hologram, making ripples in the light. The Nexus ships came from beyond Pluto. Our long-range scanners didn't work on their technology. By the time we spotted them, they had already destroyed 3 mining outposts. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. His worn jacket had a colony patch on the sleeve. He was from one of the Jupiter stations. "I remember that day," he said softly. "Every emergency channel was full of distress calls." Tommy nodded eagerly. The civilian ships were slow. They couldn't outrun the Nexus vessels. He manipulated the hologram, showing the paths of the evacuation ships. That's why Captain Walker's decision was so important. The Hope was the only military ship close enough to help. James watched as the hologram showed his old ship's position. The TSS Hope appeared as a small blue light, moving to intercept the larger red shapes of the Nexus fleet. Even now, years later, he could feel his hands trembling at the memory. "Look at these readings," Tommy said, pulling up data streams next to the battle simulation. The Hope's shields were at 40% power. 2 of their main guns were offline. They had already lost 37 crew members in an earlier battle. He looked up at James. "But you went in anyway." More people were sharing their own memories now. The store's holographic displays filled with personal videos from the evacuation. Children being rushed onto transport ships. Families huddled in emergency shelters. Through it all, the steady voice of Captain Walker could be heard, coordinating the escape. The Hope's tactical officer that day was Linda Martinez. Tommy continued, showing an image of a young woman at a battle station. She figured out that Saturn's rings could interfere with Nexus targeting systems. So Captain Walker ordered the Hope to weave through the rings, drawing the alien ships into pursuit. James remembered Linda well. She had been the one to suggest using the ice particles in Saturn's rings as a natural smokescreen. She hadn't survived the battle, but her strategy had saved countless lives. The Nexus ships were bigger and more powerful, Tommy explained, his hands moving excitedly as he spoke. But they couldn't match the Hope's maneuverability in the rings. When they tried to follow, their shields started failing. That's when Captain Walker gave the order to counterattack. The hologram showed the battle in detail. The Hope, despite its damage, executed a perfect turn in the debris field. Its remaining weapons targeted the vulnerable Nexus ships, their shields weakened by the ring particles. "This is when it happened," Tommy said more quietly, looking at James's leg. "A Nexus beam hit the bridge." But Captain Walker refused to leave his post. He kept commanding even after the medical team arrived. The Hope destroyed 3 Nexus ships before reinforcements finally came. Manager Pierce had backed away to the edge of the crowd, his expensive suit now a dull gray. The smart fabric seemed to reflect his growing shame. Other customers were looking at him with disapproval, their retinal cameras still recording everything. "Because of Captain Walker and his crew," Tommy said proudly, "not a single civilian transport was lost that day. My parents' ship made it safely to Mars, along with thousands of others. The Battle of Saturn's rings showed the Nexus that humans would fight back, that we wouldn't give up our homes in space." James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had never sought recognition for his actions, had never wanted to be reminded of that terrible day. But hearing it described by this brave young boy, seeing the gratitude in the eyes of the crowd, something began to heal inside him. "That's why this leg matters," Tommy concluded, his young voice filled with conviction. "It's not just a prosthetic. It's a mark of courage, of sacrifice, of someone who stood up when others needed help." He looked directly at Manager Pierce. kind of like what I'm doing now. The store's neural network suddenly lit up with activity as customers began sharing their personal connections to the Battle of Saturn's Rings. Holographic images appeared all around the produce section, floating between the fruit displays and grocery shelves. Each one told a different part of the story. A middle-aged woman in a medical uniform stepped forward. "My sister was a nurse on Europa Station," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She sent me this just before the evacuation." She gestured, and a new hologram appeared. A shaky video of people rushing to the transport ships, the massive form of a Nexus vessel visible through the station's windows. More images filled the air. Family photos of loved ones saved that day. News reports from Earth showing the Hope's desperate stand. Military records of the battle, preserved in public archives. The store had become a theater of memories, each one connecting back to James's sacrifice. Manager Pierce stood frozen, his expensive Mars-made suit now a sickly shade of gray. The smart fabric seemed to be reflecting his growing realization of his terrible mistake. His earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by visible shame. I didn't know," he stammered, looking at James with new eyes. "On Mars, we don't talk about the war much. It didn't affect us the same way." "Didn't affect you?" Tommy interrupted, his young face serious. "Mars only exists as a colony because of people like Captain Walker. The Nexus would have destroyed every human settlement in the solar system." An old man using a hover cane moved closer. "The boy's right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was on the Mars Defense Council during the war. We all watched the Hope's last stand. Without that ship, without that crew." He shook his head. "Mars would be a dead world today." The store's AI systems had picked up on the historical significance of the moment. The main displays now showed official military records of the battle, including the citation for James's medals. The words scrolled in the air, "For extraordinary heroism and uncommon valor in the face of overwhelming odds." Pierce's face had gone pale as he read the citation. His hands fidgeted with his now colorless tie. "Captain Walker, I apologize. My behavior was inexcusable. I let my prejudices, my ignorance." But James wasn't looking at the manager anymore. His attention was caught by a small hologram being projected by an elderly couple in the back of the crowd. It showed a nursery on one of the evacuation ships. Dozens of babies in zero-gravity cradles, all of them saved because the Hope had given their parents time to escape. "Those children would be about your age now," James said softly to Tommy. Tommy nodded. "We're called the Hope Generation," he said proudly. "All the kids born during or right after the war. Our teachers tell us we have a special responsibility to remember, to be worthy of the sacrifice." More store customers were arriving, drawn by the neural network alerts about what was happening. Many had family members who had been saved that day. They brought more memories, more stories. The produce section had become a living museum of humanity's finest hour. The cleaning robots had completely stopped their work, their basic AI protocols overridden by the historical significance of the moment. Even the store's environmental systems seemed to be running quieter, as if listening to the stories being shared. Manager Pierce had backed away to the edge of the crowd, his Mars privilege now glaringly obvious. Several customers were giving him cold looks, their retinal cameras still recording his shame for posterity. His tablet chimed with a message, probably from corporate headquarters, already aware of the situation through the viral neural feeds. But James wasn't interested in Pierce's discomfort. He was watching Tommy, who was now explaining to other children about the Hope's engine modifications that had allowed it to maneuver through Saturn's rings. The boy's eyes shone with intelligence and passion as he shared his knowledge. In that moment, surrounded by the memories of humanity's courage and the bright future it had secured, James finally understood something important. His scars, both physical and emotional, weren't marks of shame. They were bridges, connecting the past to the present, reminding everyone that in humanity's darkest hour, ordinary people could become extraordinary heroes. News of what happened at Wilson's Marketplace spread through New Portland's neural network like wildfire. Within an hour, the store's quiet morning had turned into something much bigger. People began arriving in waves, not to shop, but to share their stories. Tom from the dairy section had brought out chairs for the older veterans who came. They sat in a loose circle near the produce displays, their own mechanical limbs and neural implants on full display. No one was trying to hide their war wounds anymore. Captain Walker helped me adjust when I first got my prosthetic arm, one veteran said, rolling up his sleeve to show the older model cybernetic limb. He visited the military hospital every week, even though he was still recovering himself. A woman in her 30s stepped forward, holding her young daughter's hand. "I was just a child on one of the rescue ships," she said. "I remember being so scared. But then we heard the Hope's transmission, Captain Walker's voice telling us we would be safe, that he wouldn't let them hurt us." Tommy had become an unofficial master of ceremonies, his academy tablet collecting and displaying the stories as they were shared. His young face beamed with pride as more people came forward to speak about James's quiet acts of kindness over the years. "He helps me carry my groceries every Tuesday," Mrs. Thompson said, her garden-worn hands gesturing expressively. "Never mentions the war, never talks about what he did. Just offers to help like it's the most natural thing in the world." The store's neural network was overwhelmed with activity. People across the solar system were joining the conversation, sending messages and memories through the quantum communication channels. The holographic displays could barely keep up with all the incoming data. "See this," Tommy said, pointing to a message notification. "It's trending on Mars now." People are sharing stories about how the Hope's actions changed space warfare forever. The Nexus never expected humans to sacrifice so much to protect others. Manager Pierce had retreated to his office, but the damage was done. His tablet wouldn't stop buzzing with incoming complaints. Corporate headquarters had already issued a public statement. "Wilson's Marketplace has always been proud to serve our veteran community. The actions of our Mars Colony branch manager do not reflect our values." But the real story wasn't about Pierce's disgrace. It was about how one moment of confrontation had turned into something healing. Veterans who had been hiding their injuries began standing straighter. Young people who had only learned about the war in history classes were hearing first-hand accounts from survivors. "We should do this every week," suggested an older man with cybernetic eyes. "A meeting place for veterans and their families. Somewhere we can share our stories with the younger generation." James found himself surrounded by people who wanted to thank him, but not just for his wartime heroics. They thanked him for the small kindnesses he had shown over the years, for helping someone with their heavy bags, for teaching a child how to properly salute a flag, for always having a kind word for the store's staff. Tommy's mother had arrived, drawn by the neural network alerts about her son's involvement. Instead of being angry at him for confronting an adult, she hugged him tightly. "You did exactly what we taught you," she said, tears in her eyes. "You stood up for what's right." The store's AI had adapted to the impromptu gathering, adjusting the environmental controls to accommodate the growing crowd. The cleaning robots had arranged themselves in a protective circle around the veterans. Their basic programming expanded to include respect for historical figures. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the store's windows, something remarkable had happened. Wilson's Marketplace had transformed from a simple grocery store into a place of healing and remembrance. The produce section, where James had stumbled, had become a site of pilgrimage, where people came to share their gratitude and their stories. And through it all, James Walker stood tall, his prosthetic leg gleaming under the lights, no longer a source of shame but a badge of honor. The neural implant glitches that had started this whole incident seemed less important now, overshadowed by the warmth of community support and understanding. The next morning, Wilson's Marketplace looked very different. The corporate response had been swift and decisive. Manager Pierce's office was empty, his color-changing suit and expensive Mars cologne no longer filling the space with their pretentious presence. A simple message on the door stated he had been reassigned to store #4727 on a remote asteroid mining station. James arrived early, planning to do his regular shopping without any fuss. Instead, He found the store transformed. New holo signs had been installed overnight, showing respect for veterans prominently in glowing letters. The electromagnetic interference warning was displayed clearly at every entrance, with suggestions for those with neural implants. Captain Walker. Tommy was already there, wearing his academy uniform and practically bouncing with excitement. "You have to see this." He held up his tablet, showing the latest neural network updates. The incident had sparked a solar system-wide conversation about veteran care and recognition. Wilson's corporate headquarters had announced a new initiative. Every store would now have dedicated assistants for customers with prosthetics and neural implants. They were calling it the Hope Program, after James's old ship. "And look at this," Tommy said, switching to another screen. "The Space Fleet Academy sent me something." His eyes shined as he showed James the official communication. The Academy had awarded him a full scholarship for his future education, citing his exemplary display of the values we seek to instill in our officers. The store's staff had gathered around, led by Tom from the dairy section. "We've got something to show you too, Captain," he said, gesturing toward the front of the store. There, in a place of honor, was a new holographic display. It showed the TSS Hope in all its glory, along with the names of its crew and the lives they had saved. "The company's making these mandatory in all stores," Tom explained proudly. "But we got the first one, and there's more." The staff unveiled their surprise: a new robotic shopping assistant, specially programmed to help customers with prosthetics and neural implants. Its chrome surface gleamed under the lights, and on its side was a familiar name: Hope One. "It can detect electromagnetic interference," Tommy explained, having clearly been involved in the programming. "It warns people before their implants start glitching, and it can carry groceries or provide support if needed." James was touched by the gesture, but what happened next moved him even more. A group of medical specialists from the Mars Colonial Healthcare System had arrived. They weren't there to shop. They were there to help. "We've reviewed the footage from yesterday," the lead doctor said, her Mars accent much kinder than Pierce's had been. "Your Mark 7 prosthetic is outdated, Captain Walker. We'd like to offer you an upgrade, free of charge. It's the least we can do." The new model they showed him was sleek and advanced, with built-in electromagnetic shielding and improved neural integration. It wouldn't glitch during interference, and it would move more naturally than his old one. But James hesitated. "The scars," he said quietly. "Tommy said they're proof of what happened, of what we fought for." The doctor smiled. "We thought you might say that. Look closer." The new prosthetic had been custom designed. Along its surface, worked into the very metal itself, were the same radiation patterns from his old leg. But now they were highlighted in subtle gold, transformed from marks of damage into badges of honor. Engraved alongside them were the words TSS Hope, "We stand together." Tommy's eyes were wide with amazement. "It's beautiful," he whispered, "like a piece of history made new." The store's customers had started gathering again, drawn by the commotion. But this time, there were no stares of pity or awkward glances. There was only respect, understanding, and community. "There's one more thing," Tommy said, suddenly looking serious. "The Academy. They asked if you would consider being a guest lecturer. They want you to teach us about leadership, about standing up for what's right." He paused, then added with a grin, "I might have suggested it in my thank you letter to them." James looked around at the transformed store, at the supportive faces, at the young boy who had changed everything by simply speaking up. His old prosthetic whirred softly as he shifted his weight, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel self-conscious about the sound. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at Wilson's marketplace. The store had become more than just a place to buy groceries. It was now a gathering point for the community. Every Tuesday evening, the produce section transformed into what people lovingly called Hope Corner, where veterans and civilians shared stories and built connections. James walked through the automatic doors, his new prosthetic moving smoothly and silently. The gold-traced radiation scars caught the light, drawing admiring glances rather than pitying stares. The Hope 1 robot rolled up to greet him, its chrome surface polished to a mirror shine. "Good morning, Captain Walker," the robot chirped. "No electromagnetic interference detected today. Would you like assistance with your shopping?" Before James could answer, an excited voice called out from the Academy study corner that had been set up near the deli section. "Captain, you're early." Tommy looked up from his homework, surrounded by holographic displays showing spacecraft schematics. The boy had grown a little taller in the past months, but his enthusiasm hadn't changed. He spent most afternoons at the store, helping other children understand the history he loved so much. His academy uniform now sported a special commendation pin, the youngest recipient ever of the Civilian Valor Award. "Those calculations giving you trouble?" James asked, noticing the complex orbital mechanics homework floating in the air. "A little," Tommy admitted, "but I'll figure it out. The academy entrance exam is in 2 years, and I want to be ready." His determination was infectious, making James smile. The store had other changes too. Where Manager Pierce's office had once been, there was now a Veteran Services Center. Holographic signs offered free neural implant diagnostics and prosthetic maintenance. A retired medical officer volunteered 3 days a week, helping veterans navigate the healthcare system. Mrs. Thompson was there, tending to the new community garden that had replaced some of the less popular shelf space. Real plants grew under careful supervision, their leaves reaching toward special lights that mimicked Earth's sun. "The tomatoes are almost ready," she called out to James, "just like the ones we grew on the colonies." The store's main display still showed the TSS Hope, but now it was surrounded by photographs of the community. Veterans and civilians, young and old, all connected by the threads of shared history and mutual respect. Among them was a photo from that important day, Tommy standing up to Pierce, his small figure radiating courage. "Did you prepare your speech for tomorrow?" Tommy asked, closing his homework displays. James nodded. He had finally accepted the Academy's invitation to speak, though not just about the war. He wanted to talk about something more important. "I'm going to tell them about you," James said, watching Tommy's eyes widen. "About how real courage isn't just about fighting battles in space. Sometimes it's about a young boy who sees something wrong and decides to fix it." The afternoon sun streamed through the store's windows, casting long shadows that danced between the aisles. The cleaning robots worked quietly, their programming updated to be more respectful around veterans. Near the checkout, a group of children listened to an elderly veteran explaining how the first Mars colonies were built. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said, gathering his school things. "My mom says that before all this happened, people worried the younger generation didn't understand sacrifice, that we were too removed from the war." He looked up at James. "But we just needed someone to show us what it really meant." James reached down with his new prosthetic hand and helped Tommy with his heavy bag. The gold-traced scars caught the light, telling their story to anyone who knew how to read them. Outside, the city hummed with life. Flying cars moved between buildings, their paths forming a dance of light and shadow. But here in the store, in this small corner of New Portland, something special had taken root. It wasn't just about a veteran and a kind child, or about a community learning to see past its prejudices. It was about hope, the kind that had saved humanity during the war, and the kind that would carry them forward into the future. As James and Tommy walked toward the exit together, their shadows merged on the floor, the old soldier and the young student, the past and the future, connected by understanding and respect. The Hope 1 robot followed quietly behind them, its sensors detecting no glitches, no interference, only the steady beat of human hearts working together to build a better world.